Hey yo, what is up guys, it's your boy the True Seeker 101 back with another video, and on today's video I'm going to be showing you guys this video that I came across that shows how the deep state was involved in the murder of one of America's heroes, General Patton. And it's a really interesting video which basically shows how the people we think that run our government aren't really the people that are in charge, and how there's a deep state within the government who's really behind everything. But yeah, with that being said, if you guys do enjoy content like this, go ahead and like up the video, and most importantly, hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications so you don't miss out on the latest bangers that are going to be opening your eyes to the truth of how this world we live in really operates.
Welcome listeners. You are listening to a podcast from the Free People's Movement out of Sweden. The murder of an American hero. General George S. Patton was one of the most prominent generals on the side of the Allies during World War II. He is now so legendary that it is difficult to know where Patton ends and where the myth begins. We will shed light on Patton's fate from a slightly different perspective, while at the same time wondering, what might Donald Trump think about this issue? George S. Patton was born on November 11, 1885, and died on December 21, 1945, in Heidelberg, in Allied-occupied Germany. He died shortly after a car crash had left him paralyzed. But we will come back to Patton's death a little bit later. During World War II, Patton led the American armored forces in North Africa, landed in Italy, and was one of the leaders in the liberation of Europe. The Germans had signed their unconditional surrender to the Allied forces in May of 1945, a victory largely won off the backs of Patton's unstoppable Third Army that stampeded its way across northern France after the successful D-Day invasion. Under Patton's decisive leadership, the Third Army drove retreating German forces out of occupied territories in an unprecedented display of military brilliance, enabling, among other feats, the liberation of Paris, said Patton biographer Robert Wilcox. But toward the end of the war, General Eisenhower and other commanding officers had come to consider General Patton a liability for his unorthodox approach to warfare. Patton had repeatedly defied authority, challenged orders, and loudly disagreed with the United States post-war foreign policy. General Patton was an outspoken critic of the Soviets, going against the U.S. foreign policy position that saw the Soviets as an ally and crucial to maintaining peace in Europe. Patton told his peers, "We've kicked the hell out of one bastard, only to help establish a second one, more evil and more dedicated than the first." Patton hated kowtowing to the Kremlin. Furthermore, he protested against the secret decision that Washington made, not to press the Russians for the safe return of thousands of captured Allied POWs that were still under Soviet control in 1945. As a result, these abandoned POWs were either shot or spent the rest of their lives working in gulags. Furthermore, Patton simply couldn't understand why the West had conceded Eastern Europe to the Soviet Union, and had voiced his concern about this openly. Among others, biographer Douglas Wilcox wrote in his book called Target, Patton, that he believes that the plot to stop Patton could have easily evolved into an assassination order. Citing Eisenhower's political ambitions, Wilcox wrote, "The writing was on the wall." Now that victory in Europe was clearly in sight, Patton was no longer needed. His flamboyant style and unpredictability was becoming a liability that Eisenhower could not afford anymore. Well, even if that was the case, there could very well be even more obvious reasons for wanting to get Patton out of the way. Obvious, if you know the real history. What is less well known, for reasons that are easy to understand today, is the fact that Patton visited Sweden twice. The first time was as a participant in the 1912 Olympic Games in Stockholm. Patton traveled at his own expense and participated in pentathlon, where among other things, fencing, shooting, and off-road riding were included. A mistake occurred in the shooting. Patton thought that a military weapon should be used, and chose a heavy caliber .38 revolver, while most competitors used a .22 caliber. The problem was that Patton's heavier ammunition tore apart the center of the target, so that the referees could not ensure that all the shots had hit. Patton was awarded a miss, despite the opinion of other competitors that all shots had hit the mark. The result was that Patton ended up in 27th place in the shooting and 4th place overall. Without this mistake, Patton would have become a gold medalist. Patton was a horseman and competed as a jumper and polo player. He is best known in the horse context for his efforts to save the Lipizzaner stallions from the Spanish riding school in Vienna. 1,200 German war booty horses, of which 300 Lipizzaners, were also rescued from an uncertain fate. In this way, many breeding lines could be saved. After the end of the war in 1945, Patton came into conflict with the political arm of the deep state in the United States. His statements had been controversial, and Patton was virtually deprived of his command, but was hailed everywhere as a great hero and liberator. In the autumn of 1945, Patton visited acquaintances and official figures in France, England, Denmark, and Sweden, which can probably today be seen as somewhat naive. After the end of the war, the Swedish government wanted to invite General Eisenhower to Sweden. Eisenhower was, although, as luck would have it, busy with other duties, and he suggested in a practical way that General Patton would instead represent him during the visit to Sweden. Let's just say that Eisenhower knew about the Bosch affair. At the end of November 1945, Patton visited Sweden. The then Army Chief General Archibald Douglas gave dinner at Taka Udden in Stockholm, and Patton was in great shape as the socialite he really was. However, he was not able to completely hide his deep suspicion of the Soviet Union, unfortunately. For example, the story behind the Russian Revolution, and the fact that Stalin had an own villa in Stockholm during the war, called Villa Kassman, was apparently not so well known to the general. Patton had walked right into the wolf's den and hadn't realized it, at least not before it was too late. He is said to have visited the Swedish king, Gustav V, completely informally, and little did he know about the intrigues between the Swedish king and a man called Kurt Heiby, Torsten Noting, and Saro. Let's just say that the connection between the Swedish establishment and the Nazis would have been more apparent to him then. But that's another story. Patton also met the Swedish pentathlon team from 1912, and a proper party had been arranged, probably at Stålmastergarden. During the party, pistols were produced, and a reshooting of the Olympic bout from 1912 was made. Patton had the opportunity to now significantly improve his result, and happily got to take the new target home, as a memory of the evening. On the morning of November 30, 1945, an expectant crowd in the Hagedal terrain stood waiting for the American armored general, George Patton. The program included a one-day visit to Uppsala at Upplands Regiment. A realistic warlike exercise was to be held in Patton's honor. The preparations had taken several hours, and now both the commander and the troops were waiting for the well-known armored general's arrival in Hagedalen. He arrived at the appointed time, accompanied by, among others, Prince Gustav Adolf and several senior military and civilian dignitaries. The exercises went well, and the guest showed a lively interest in what was going on, as he followed in the front lines and often consulted with both officers and privates. Finally, he gave an overview of the course of events for the assembled battalion, in Patton's Hage, a name later given to the location, derived from this occasion. The journey was then directed to the castle, where Governor Hildering Kjellman was Cicero. The intention was to then continue to the cathedral, but when General Patton came down from the hall to the courtyard, he suddenly said, "I do not want to go to that church, because it reminds me that I am going to die." The program must therefore be changed, and the thousands of Uppsala residents who waited in the drizzle in the surroundings of the cathedral had to turn home. After lunch at the officers' fair at Polakbacken, to which several Uppsala residents and some who participated in modern pentathlon during the Olympic Games in Stockholm were invited. At coffee time, some of them sat with him. The general then gave an exhaustive and vivid description of his war experiences. He eventually got on with his task of conquering Prague at the end of the war and being ordered to stop at the border with Czechoslovakia, because the Russians would get the credit for the conquest of Prague. Patton then spoke about his efforts to have the order revoked and about his failure in this regard. "Finally, I sat down and cried over my superior's short-sightedness," the general closed his story. He then assessed what the world had to expect as a result of all the misguided consideration of Stalin. Patton's views on the matter were quite harsh, which some years later would prove absolutely correct, above all concerning Germany's shared status, in an eerie way. Colonel All-Norman would 20 years later be quoted in the book My Uppsala, saying, "For my part, I have never before or since heard anyone who has been so prophesied in major political matters as this American general." Patton basically predicted the Cold War. Take a wild guess whether that would have been a popular thing to say within the best-kept secret of the deep state, Sweden. The military attaché that was Patton's escort during his visit to Sweden was called Thord Bond. Thord Bond was the son of Carl Bond, which during this time was storing the documents from Operation Stella Polaris at his castle, Horningsholm. To make things even more special, it was in fact that same Carl Bond that had won the gold medal, instead of Patton, at the Olympics in 1912. Like we've said before, you can't even make this up. Carl Bond and Patton met at that same Horningsholm castle for dinner, and that would be the last night in Sweden for Patton's part. The deep state had been by Patton's side every step of the way. Patton's visit to Sweden was no coincidence. The whole point had been to feel him out and decide what they should do about him. What could possibly go wrong for Patton after that? About a week later, back in Germany, Patton's chief of staff, General Hobart Gay, suggested a hunting trip. They left the next day in Patton's Cadillac. Driving them was 19-year-old Private First Class Horace Woodring, and they were accompanied by Sergeant Joe Screws, who was leading them in an open-air jeep that carried rifles, supplies, and a hunting dog. The drive began without incident. The weather was cold but visibility was clear and the road was virtually uninhabited of any and all traffic. Sitting in the back seat, Patton was surveying the war-torn landscape, littered by derelict vehicles, and remarked, "How awful war is. Think of the waste." Woodring stopped at a railroad track to allow for the passing train and noticed off in the distance a standard-issue GMC armor truck that was pulled over on the shoulder of the road. Just as Woodring started back up, the 2.5-ton truck, with a canvas-covered flatbed, pulled away from the curb and began slowly advancing in their direction. Woodring later said that he didn't think anything of it at the time. Suddenly, as the two vehicles were about to pass, the truck driver inexplicably took a vicious, hard left turn in front of Patton's Cadillac. "I had no opportunity to avoid him whatsoever," said Horace Woodring in a 1986 interview, and the two vehicles crashed in relative slow motion, going 20 miles per hour. General Patton had ricocheted onto General Gay's lap, where he laid momentarily unconscious and bleeding from a massive head injury that extended from the bridge of his nose up toward the middle of his scalp. Patton told Gay, "I'm having trouble breathing, Hap. Work my fingers for me." As Gay moved Patton's fingers, it became clear that he had no feeling in them. He continued his plea, "Go ahead, Hap. Work my fingers." Patton was paralyzed. Despite the proximity of a hospital in Mannheim, he was taken to a facility over 20 miles away, in Heidelberg. At first Patton's prognosis was not good. He remained in critical condition for the first few days when he began to make remarkable strides toward recovery. His presiding physician, Dr. Sterling, wrote on his medical chart, "The muscles of respiration began to function feebly." This gave us high hopes that the spinal cord was not as seriously damaged as we had every reason to believe in the beginning. In addition to these favorable neurological signs, his general condition remained remarkably good. The truck driver responsible for the fatal crash was a soldier from Camden, New Jersey, named Robert Thompson. He had stolen the army vehicle, or perhaps taken it out for a joyride with two other passengers that were never named or seen again, but are pictured in the background of the only image that exists from the accident scene. Nobody has ever been able to explain why or what Thompson was doing 50 miles away from his base. He had no order to be there and he was in violation of his rules. General Patton continued to improve, and on December 18th, he told his wife, "I am feeling really well." For the first time. Just as they began to make arrangements to send Patton home, he took a turn for the worse. 30 minutes after his wife left the hospital to procure lunch, on December 21, 1945, General Patton suffered a massive pulmonary embolism. General Patton was dead. Wilcox, the Patton biographer, had contacted Horace Woodring's son, John, who also finds the entire collision suspicious. He said, as soon as the truck driver got to him, he veered right into the car, 3 drunk truck occupants who pretty much disappeared with all the general's flags and what not. They accidentally turn into that? I don't think so. Not even if they were drunk. When asked if his father may have thought the collision was an assassination attempt, Woodring's son said, well, you know, he always had his thoughts possibly that it could have been. Military police and a number of unidentified investigators had descended on the collision scene with unprecedented speed. This alone is curious seeing as how the accident took place on a deserted road in a remote area. The collision was said to have occurred around 11:45 a.m. Patton was in an ambulance by 12:20, which begs the questions, how were responding officers able to arrive so quickly? Had they known of a plot to assassinate Patton ahead of time? Were they just standing by waiting for it to happen? Inexplicably, Robert Thompson, the truck driver, was quickly whisked away by the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, CID. Wilcox learned of this revelation from Thompson's lawyer, who said, the CID got him out of Germany that night. They flew him to England. He was incommunicado for a couple of days. If this is true, the move was unusual. Why would Thompson need to be taken to an undisclosed location in England when there were American forts nearby in Frankfurt and Nuremberg? What was he doing there? Like most details in this case, there is no record of Thompson's 4-day trip to the UK. In fact, there is not even a mention of General Patton in Thompson's military file at all. Many of these outstanding questions might easily be answered if reports from the scene and subsequent investigations hadn't mysteriously vanished. The fact that an official accident report and all other records pertaining to the death of one of America's most decorated war heroes is missing seems more than suspicious. It's unfathomable. Especially when considering the exacting measures to which the military approaches documentation. In 1979, a former member of World War II's elite Black Ops team, known as Jed Burroughs, made the astonishing allegation that he was hired as a hitman to kill Patton. Douglas Bazata claimed that it was an order given to him by General Wild Bill Donovan, the chief of the Office of Strategic Services, an intelligence organization that was the precursor to the CIA. The OSS. Remember who was the chief of the OSS in Switzerland at the time? Alan Dulles. Wonder if he knew General Donovan. While serving as a Jedburgh, Bazata was an expert marksman and hired assassin who completed many covert operations that involved him dangerously parachuting into enemy lines to help organize the resistance in France. On the CIA's webpage dedicated to the Jedburghs, it lists their motto as surprise, kill, and vanish, which eerily rings true in Bazata's mission to stop Patton. Bazata said that the car accident was just a ruse for him to shoot the general with a silent projectile that he said would cause the equivalent of a whiplash suffered at a speed of 80 or 100 miles an hour. He explained that he hid behind derelict equipment, cast away on the side of the road, waiting for Patton's car to drive by. Furthermore, he said that this special-made weapon was fashioned in a foreign country, whose identity he never knew. Instead of bullets, the device launched rocks that could easily look like debris in the aftermath and create damage that didn't look like bullet wounds. Perhaps this explains why Patton's injuries were so severe in comparison to the other passengers who walked away from the accident with just a few scrapes. Experts were always confounded by how the general broke his neck in whiplash going 20 miles per hour. Well, seeing as Wild Bill Donovan was already dead, long before 1979, and this drew attention away from the now obvious suspects. This revelation might indeed have stopped people from looking further into this matter. They give you enough for closure, but never seem to get caught, and nobody behind the scenes ever goes to jail. Seem familiar? Towards the end of his career, Bazata worked as an aide to the Navy Secretary during the Reagan administration, was a member of the 9/11 Commission and worked on Senator McCain's 2008 presidential campaign. Bazata might indeed have shot Patton, but now he was acting as a decoy, and pointed to Donovan's orders to draw people off the scent, and he got a wonderful career as thanks. In 2014, the host of the CBS This Morning, Bill O'Reilly, said, "We call for a reopening of the investigation by the Justice Department today. I want to know who killed this hero, and I certainly do not believe it was an accident." Patton, 1 minute, was joking with the nurses and drinking cognac in his bed, and then all of a sudden the next day, boom, he was dead. General Patton was a threat to the deep state and the hidden enemy's plans, and got killed for it. It was then covered up, like always. It's time the truth came to light. Why is Patton so important? Well, you do the math. When did he die? Go look at some pictures of General Patton. Who does he look like? Maybe there are lots of people with an axe to grind with the deep state. Maybe some of those people actually decided to do something about it. And maybe these players don't just plan 1 or 2 steps ahead. The best is yet to come. Thank you for listening.